My aunt had gone on a rant about how immigrants shouldn't be allowed into this country, and her immigrant caregiver was sitting right over there. It was the first time I'd ever said anything like that, even to my aunt, even though her whole life she had said outrageous things. She had no restraint. If it came into her head, it went out of her mouth. That's the last time I ever saw her before she died. Aunt Dot was my childless aunt, the aunt who had been there my entire life. A holiday wasn't an occasion without my Aunt Dot and her gifts and her camera. I have a huge stack of pictures my cousin gave me after he cleaned out her condo. She was an integral part of my life. But after calling her rude, I never saw her again. I didn't call her, and she didn't call me. You see, I didn't know what to say to her. I was still mad, but more than that, I felt stuck. What can I say? To this day, I still have thoughts. I should call Aunt Dot and tell her. And then I remember. Similar scenes are playing out across our country. Sons disowning mothers, parents of children cutting grandparents out of their kids' lives, couples splitting up, or just yelling at each other all the time, and name calling. Baby killer, racist, fascist, the list goes on and on. Holidays have become a minefield, a nightmare. The fabric of our lives is unraveling. A political divide is tearing apart our families, our friendships, our churches, our neighborhoods. I'm not the only one. I see friends unfriending people on Facebook, where they stop dropping in. Neighbors ignore each other. My small homeowners association had a fight over one neighbor who wanted to put up a political sign outside of the rules. People got really tired of fighting about it. A podcast host I was talking to told me she avoids going outside to garden when a neighbor of hers is playing the favorite radio station at the top of volume. Who are you avoiding or yelling at or unfriending? As I said, we're not just divided politically, we're divided in our families, our friends, and our neighbors. We have made our loved ones into the enemy, and we're stuck. How can we solve this? This has particular relevance for us Quakers. We have a mission to bring peace and also to see that of God in everyone we meet. But we also have a mission to make the world a better place, to bring about heaven on earth. We take up social causes, demonstrate, and try to push towards a better world. But how can we do both? How can we learn to see that of God in the people we dislike and learn to talk to them and not just attend demonstrations? Part of my answer in a book that I read while I was in seminary, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Now, one of the key concepts there I learned was a simple one. That we need to separate the person from the issues and from the values that they hold. We need to accept the person for who they are and the values that they hold for what they bring. And let me talk more about values in a minute. These values are invisible to us. We never talk about them, ever, ever, ever. But we fight wars over them. People are willing to die for these values that we never talk about. Haidt says that there's 5 key values that everyone in the world shares. Now, these are from cross-cultural studies that have been done with hundreds of thousands of people across the world in various different types of cultures and countries. The next set of the slides I'm going to show you are montages of pictures that represent each of the 5 values that Haidt describes. I'm going to show you each montage, and then please call out the words that come to mind when you see the pictures. Now, for those of you with a poor connection, instead of unmuting yourself, you might want to consider putting it in the chat. And then, Kristen, I would ask you to read out what's in the chat because I'm not going to look at what's in the chat. Okay, so here's the first montage. Unmute yourself and tell me what words come to mind when you see these pictures.
Heard.
Heard.
Unity.
Unity.
Teamwork.
Teamwork. Good. I think my montage pretty much worked. Let me give you the words that I'm going to use in this presentation and I use in my book. And these are different than the words height uses for the same factor, but my words are belonging and community. The word community comes out of the Quaker testimony for community. And I think Haidt's name for it, which is, if you ever read The Righteous Mind, he calls it loyalty to the group. And I think that underplays the importance of this variable. So I call it belonging community because I think that that is a better representation of what's involved. Here's the second montage. What words come to mind when you see these pictures?
Authority.
Authority. Exactly right. Very simple. Authority or respect for authority. I'm going to use both of them. Here's the third montage. What words come to mind?
Sanctity.
Sanctity. Exactly. I'm going to use sacredness and purity for the presentation today. Here's the fourth one. What words come to mind when you see these pictures?
Balance and justice.
Balance and justice. Anything else? I'm going to use the word fairness, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. And here's the last montage. What words come to mind for these pictures?
Caring.
Caring, absolutely.
Nurturing.
What's that?
Nurturing.
Nurturing, yes. Yes, that's definitely part of this. So I'm going to use the words care for others or perhaps care harm. And these are the 5 moral foundations that Haidt used when he developed the theory, moral foundations theory. So just to review, the names I'm using: belonging, community, respect for authority, sacredness, purity, fairness, and care for others. And if someone could put those in the chat, I would greatly appreciate that because we're going to need them in a few minutes.
I got you.
Thank you. So I see people have joined, and so it's a good thing it wasn't in there before. Okay, so we all, I mean all humans across cultures have the same 5 values, but, and there's a big but, we have conflicts because we give different importance to the different ones, and we have different interpretations that we give to them. And that's what causes our conflicts. It's not because we have different values, it's because we either put different importance or different interpretations. Let me explain more about that. Survey results show that when you ask people to have people self-identify whether they're liberal or conservative, those who are liberal tend to put much more importance on the bottom 2, on fairness and care for others. On the other hand, when people self-identify as conservatives, they tend to be even approximately across all 5. Now, that doesn't mean that each conservative is even. It means that overall they're even. And there's some variations, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I just got the results from someone I asked to take the test, and they're happen to be particularly high in sacredness, purity. You know, everybody's got their own little quirk about them. But this is the overall pattern that is pretty standard for people. So what does this mean? Because this pattern, it means conservatives are higher in belonging because liberals are relatively low. And there's also a difference in interpretation in that belonging tends to be place-based, which is why you see more nationalistic kinds of comments coming from conservatives than you do from liberals who are more global citizens. Conservatives are higher in respect for authority, liberals are relatively low. And conservatives are higher in sacredness, purity, and they have different interpretations. Here I've taken those same pictures And I've reorganized them. And I put the pictures that are more standard religious pictures to the right, which tends to be more of their interpretation. And I've taken the more purity-based pictures and put them to the left. It's different interpretations of the same moral foundations. And that's the point of Haidt's analysis. Now, here's the really tough part to talk about. Sacredness seems like it's a really good thing, but how do you know when you violated someone's sense of sacredness? It comes out as disgust. And this is a tip-off word and a tip-off feeling, and it's related to our feeling of nausea when we eat some food that is bad or just doesn't agree with us. And Charles Darwin first described this, and he described the look on your face, which is still the same today, and it has to do with what happens with your nose and the mouth and your upper lip, where there's sort of this curled lip that you have when you're disgusted. And that happens when you taste or see a food that makes you feel nauseous, but it also happens when you run into something that makes you feel disgusted, when it's violated your sense of sacredness. And that can be somebody who's fat, it can be bloody kinds of things, violations of skin, but unfortunately can also be people of a different race. People who tend to have the most racist attitudes tend to be the most easily disgusted and easily nauseated. And one of the most interesting findings that I ran across when I was doing research for the book was that one study gave people a set of ginger pills, and another set of people didn't get pills, they got a placebo. And they surveyed them about their attitudes, and ginger, which acts as an anti-nauseant, actually reduced their racist attitudes. So this goes so, so deep. Okay, good, I'm past that slide. Fairness. Liberals place more importance on fairness. I said it was extremely high. They also tend to a different interpretation of fairness. The interpretation of, or I call it a flavor of, equality. Conservatives, on the other hand, have a different flavor of fairness, which is merit. Let me explain more about what I mean. The picture I've chosen on the left shows two stones that are balanced. The stones are different colors, they're about the same size. And that's really a representation that I thought was a good representation of equality. On the other hand, the balance beam on the right is kind of weird, right? There's that balance, that side that looks much larger, but it's even with the smaller one. And how can that be? Shouldn't it be down on the bottom? And I'm using that to represent the idea of merit-based fairness. And this is something that you might think about happens when talk about college admissions, where not everybody gets in. And when we talk about what's fair, we rarely talk about our interpretation of what's fair. And we're going to talk about this more later. So think about what your interpretation of fairness is, but keep that in the back of your mind. We'll get back to it. And then finally, everyone believes in caring, but for conservatives, it's mediated or interacted with by the other foundations. So it doesn't always take the top place like it does with liberals. And these differences that I'm talking about go so deep that they actually show up in different brain functioning. Here I've highlighted the amygdala, the insula is also involved, the prefrontal cortex gets involved sometimes. You see differences in sweat production, you see difference in saliva production. So it's no wonder that when we talk to each other, we're not convincing each other that we don't do it, because we can't change people's brains and the way they function. This makes people complicated and unpredictable because we have 5 of these moral foundations. They can reinforce each other. And if they reinforce each other, they become really, really strong. Or they can conflict. And if they can conflict, you never know how it's going to turn out. I've been surprised as I've been studying this. So let's take this back to my Aunt Dot. What caused the conflict? Let's talk about it in terms of the moral foundations. My Aunt Dot was talking about the issue of immigration, and I can't ask her anymore because she's no longer with us. But I would guess that she was really high in the value of belonging. That's what immigration tends to be about, although it can be about other things, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Me, on the other hand, I'm sitting there in the room with Jeannie, Aunt Dot's immigrant caregiver, and I'm concerned about Jeannie's feelings at that particular moment. So I have care for other on my mind. And that's why I called her rude. So we're both talking about immigration, maybe, but we're using different values, and that's what caused the conflict. So we never talk about these values. They're invisible to us. So now that you know the basics, let's practice. I've created a collection, I've pulled together a collection of ads and website materials and other things that each draw on one or more of the moral foundations that we've been talking about. And that's why I wanted you to put it in the chat, because I want you to have it accessible to you. As I show them, I want you to call out the moral foundations that you see in each one of these images. And there could be more than one, and people see different things. There's no wrong answers. If you have a problem with your connection, again, use the chat, and I would ask someone to read it out, because I can't check the chat. Okay, here we go. Just to review, the 5 of them are belonging, community, respect for authority, sacredness, purity, fairness, and care for others. Here's a headline from the New York Times. A lesson of Sandy Hook. Err on the side of the victims. A tidal wave of aid bore witness to the power of human kindness. The money that engulfed Newtown, Connecticut also sowed division. What moral foundation, or more than one, are being evoked or referenced in this headline and the picture?
Care for others.
Care for others. Anything else?
Fairness.
Fairness. I've heard fairness as well several times. Okay, number 2. This is from the website of the ACLU. LGBT rights. The ACLU works to ensure that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people can live openly without discrimination and enjoy equal rights, personal autonomy, and freedom of expression and association. What moral foundation is the ACLU referencing when they create this statement?
Community.
Community?
Fairness.
Fairness.
Fairness. The word equal is a tip off here. Absolutely. There's definitely fairness in here. Anything else? I think that's about it. Okay, this is from the Australian Post Office. If you really want to touch someone, send them a letter. What moral foundation is being referenced here?
Belonging.
Belonging, yeah.
Care for others.
Care.
Care, definitely. Definitely. I think both. Okay, here we have an old poster for the Army. I want you for the US Army. What moral foundations are being evoked in this image?
Respect for authority.
Respect for authority, yeah. Yeah. I've also heard belonging because it's the US country. Number 5, Walmart is making a $250 billion commitment to American manufacturing. What moral foundation is Walmart using in this ad?
Community, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah, to America. Definitely. Definitely. Number 6. Now I really need to explain this because I don't think the ad works as well, but it illustrates something I want to use. So this is an ad from UN Women. And you can see there's a search box where somebody has typed in the words, women need to. And there's these quote unquote suggestions that the search engine has provided. And those suggestions read things like women need to be put in their place, women need to know their place, women need to be controlled, women need to be disciplined. But what the UN Women want to convey is underneath, and you can't really see it very well, but it says women need to be seen as equal. What moral foundations are the UN Women working with in this ad?
Oh, fairness again.
Mm-hmm. Again, the word equal, another tip-off word. Anything else?
You know, with that being so small, though, I think of respect for authority.
Yes, in the suggestions,
Yeah.
those are the respect for authority kinds of words. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the ad is problematic. I don't think it does what it's intended to do. I think it's actually could backfire. But it has both of those intention in the ad, and I wanted to show that to you for that reason. Number 7 is a magazine available on the shelf called Clean Eating. What moral foundation is being evoked in the title of this magazine?
Purity, sacredness.
Yes, purity. Absolutely. Absolutely. Number 8, this is a screenshot from an old McDonald's commercial. You deserve a break today. What moral foundation was McDonald's using when they had this ad years and years ago?
Care.
Care?
Yeah.
Anything else? I see fairness in here with the word deserve. And McDonald's is credited with starting a movement towards using the concept of deserve or fairness in ads. And the last one is an ad from a German travel company that was oriented towards gay people, queer people. The other side of America. What moral foundations are they poking fun at here?
Authority.
Authority, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I've also heard people saying it poking fun at belonging as well.
Okay.
So you can see how these moral foundations are involved in our everyday lives and things that we see in our headlines, in our newspaper articles, in the ads we see. The moral foundations are embedded in our whole lives and evoke them without us really realizing it. And one of the objectives I have for you today is to start to be able to see these where they are. And as I've become more and more familiar with the moral foundations and seeing them, I'm able to choose my response much more carefully than just reacting. And the last thing I want to do to test our understanding is I've created some statements about immigration that represents different positions and different ways to use a moral foundation statement in a moral foundation concept in a statement about the same issue. So statement number 1, and I want you to, again, either put in the chat or yell out what moral foundation is being evoked in this statement. Number 1, keeping people from other countries out of the US harms potential immigrants.
It would be care.
Yes, right. Harm is a tip-off word there. Number 2, keeping people from other countries out of the US isn't fair because they didn't ask to be born where they're born.
So,
Fairness.
Fairness, yes.
fair.
Number 3, keeping people from other countries out of the US is necessary because we need to ensure that we have enough for the people who already live here. What moral foundation?
Belonging, community.
Belonging, community.
Yes, yes. And then finally, keeping people from other countries out of the US is necessary because we have to protect our country from people like that.
Sacredness, purity.
I think I got it. Can you repeat it?
Sacredness, purity.
Yes, it is purity. It is purity. Anytime we denigrate people and demean them, that's a way of accessing the moral foundation of purity. Absolutely. Okay, you guys have got it. Now, you're starting to see the moral foundations that are embedded in our world, and they're everywhere. Once you start to look, you just aren't going to be able to go back. So I've achieved the first objective of my talk. But what can we do with it? Is it just nice to know? I believe it's not just nice to know. I believe it is crucial to know if we want to change the conversation, if we want to persuade people and not preach to them, we need to learn how to talk in a different way. So what would it be like if instead of talking from our own values, instead of talking the way we usually do, if we could talk to someone from a different set of values? And an Aesop fable illustrates this point. The sun and the wind decided to have a contest to see which one would be the most powerful. Both of them were trying to get the traveler to take off their cloak. The wind went first and blew as hard as it could. That's what it's like when we argue vehemently from our own point of view, from our own values. Of course, what does the traveler do? It holds onto their cloak even more tightly. The sun goes next. It shines brightly and warms up the earth. The traveler sits down, takes off their cloak, and basks in the sun. So which one was most powerful? Seems to me the sun is. That's what it's like when we talk to someone from their own values and not from ours. In fact, the psychology research backs this up. If we can get people to relax, we can get them to bask in the idea that somebody agrees with them, and then they're more likely to listen to us. And the more powerfully we argue, the more strongly they hold on to their beliefs. So if we can do it right, maybe we can persuade. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't work all the time, but it does work much better than yelling. And that's one example of what I mean when I say persuade, don't preach. But let's talk about what the research says. There are two psychology researchers who've been very active in this field by the name of Rob Willer and Matt Feinberg. And sometimes I show a TED Talk that Rob Willer gave. It has, millions of views. But I'm going to talk about his research and then I'm going to talk about how to apply it. But please, consider going to watch the video on the TED website. And I'll offer my website as a resource, and I'll show you at the end. And there's a link to the Willer video if you don't want to search around for it. So anyway, what Willer and Feinberg did was 5 studies, each on an issue, where they took what the normal argument would be and they turned it on its head and used a different value than the normal one. So they did support for an army targeted at liberals, and they used a liberal value. They did English as a required language in the US, and they used a liberal value. They took on the issue of universal health care, and they used for conservatives, and they used a conservative value. Same thing with environmental issues, same thing with same-sex marriage. In all of these cases, they were able to persuade more people by using a value that was appropriate for the person they were talking to than when they did it the other way around. And in fact, these results were so strong that when they also, in the environmental study, they also asked about climate change. And the results were so strong that even though they didn't talk about climate change, changing the way they talked about the environmental issue actually changed the way people felt about climate change. It was really amazing how powerful it was. But it's one thing if it's just an experimental technique. But what I've been doing is been collecting examples of how it's been used or not used in the real world and the kind of impact it's had. And let me share with you some of the things I've uncovered. The first example I'm going to use is from the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand in 2017. Just to refresh your memory of the details, there was an Australian who perpetrated this, and he killed 51 people in 2 mosques. He was on his way to the 3rd when he was stopped. He bought the guns in New Zealand where it was allowed because New Zealand had no gun control laws. Why not? It's a rural country with sheep farmers. It's a conservative country. They need their guns. But here's what Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, said after the Christchurch shooting, and look for the moral foundation in what I'm saying. They are us, meaning the victims are us. The person who has perpetrated this violence against us is not. They have no place in New Zealand. This is such a strong statement of belonging in every part of this, taking the victims into the country as making them part of them and expelling the idea of the perpetrator as not, even though the race of the perpetrator was different than the victims. And within 2 weeks after this, New Zealand passed their first ever gun control legislation. And I have to believe that using a conservative belonging community variable moral foundation the way she did, she had to have helped it, because a lot of times we've seen gun control legislation falter after events. But if you use the right language and you appeal to the right values, maybe you can have a difference the way Jacinda Ardern did. That's example 1. Example 2 has some data from Pew Research about same-sex marriage. Now, I said that Willer and Feinberg had done same-sex marriage. Let me tell you what they did, and let me tell you what was done here, I believe. So Willer and Feinberg created a message for conservatives about same-sex marriage, that people who are gay deserve to marry each other because they're Americans. So they used the conservative value of belonging, and that worked, okay? But they kind of missed what was going on in the meantime in the real world while they did their research. The research was done in around 2010. And as you can see from this chart, at the beginning of this period, 2004, it was about 2 to 1 against gay marriage, 60% opposed to 31% approve. 15 years later, during 2019, it had swapped, with 61% approve and 31% disapprove. Now, a lot of people think it was because of the same-sex marriage Supreme Court decision. It wasn't. There was an impact of that, but a lot of the change happened beforehand. So what happened? Oh, and by the way, this kind of change, this fast, has never, ever, ever happened before. Ever. And people who study this say that if you could replicate this, you would have major changes in all sorts of civil rights issues. But we don't do that, okay? How did this happen? Well, a few things are going on. And I did a bunch of studying to try to figure out what was going on, and sleuthing. The first thing is that towards the beginning of this campaign, one of the things that was going on was there was a disagreement in the gay rights activism groups about how to approach getting rights for gays. And there were people who really wanted to be anti-establishment, anti-authority, and let's tear down the patriarchy. And there was another group, or one particular person, who was really persistent in suggesting the focus on gay marriage itself, that they should share in the rights and privileges of marriage, which was especially important during and right after the AIDS crisis. Eventually, he won out. One person I know who was involved in this campaign as an ally told me that she got an email telling her the exact words to use in the campaign and the exact words not to use, and those were the words she was going to use. So using the ACLU words wouldn't have worked with conservatives. But what I think they did was they used the idea of marriage as being, they may not have used this word sacred, but certainly accepting that marriage was important and a conservative value was important. And that was the key to at least unlocking at least some of this change. There was also a campaign of deep canvassing going on, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. That's example 2. Example 3 is the environmental issue. Again, this was another issue that Willer and Feinberg took on. And here we see what happens when you don't use the right language, when you don't use the language of the person you're talking to. This is data from 1994 to 2016. You can see at the beginning of this period, Democrats were more in favor of environmental issues than Republicans, but there's not a huge gap. 71 to 85, 14%, you know, there's a gap, but it's not huge. That gap has widened by the period, by the last year, 2016, to 90% Democrats in favor of environmental issues and 52% of Republicans in favor. How did that happen? So you see, most of the change happened in the mid to late aughts, right? And what was going on there was a shift in what was being said about the environment. Up until then, most environmental campaigns had used the language of the purity of the earth, the beauty, the sacredness of the earth. That's what if you look at the old Earth Day campaigns, up until this period, that's what was being used. And so that's a conservative value. And so that was propping up this Republican support for environmental issues. And that's what Willer and Feinberg found, is when they used the purity of the earth, they got greater support from self-described conservatives. But what happened in the mid-aughts was there was a pivot to the issue of climate change. And the way climate change is talked about, it's talked about in terms of the destruction and uses a lot of the care harm language, which is much more focused on what liberals find important. That strengthened the liberal position, and it really opposed what conservatives find important. And again, Willer and Feinberg, by shifting the language back to sanctity and purity, found that you could get support for climate change if you use the right language. But if you use the wrong language, like we've been doing in the environmental movement, you won't get support among the people who are the least likely to support you. So we're not talking to the people who oppose us, we're talking to ourselves, is what we're doing. That's example 3. Example number 4 is from Texas. I don't know if anybody here has traveled in Texas. This is a campaign that has been running for over 30 years in Texas. Texas had a major problem over 30 years ago with littering, and that could be a freedom issue. I can throw out my garbage wherever. So they started this campaign, and it's Don't Mess with Texas. And as you can see, it's got this scolding kind of tone, which is an authority tone, and it's also plays with the idea of pride of being a Texan. So it's got both belonging and authority. And 30 years ago, Texas was a very red state. Now it's maybe purple, but this campaign has worked beautifully in Texas. It has cleared up the roads. It is a very popular campaign. They have done many, many different forms of it in billboards and radio ads, in TV ads, in newspaper ads. It's just all over the place, and people love it. And it's really encouraged people to be prideful of being a Texan and being prideful of how they treat their country. And here's my last example from conservative Utah. The Brigham Young University Recycling Department has actually started using Willer and Feinberg's language, where they say service with respect for sacred resources for the physical facilities recycling. Mormons are great at using the latest psychology research. I've seen other examples when I was out there. This was a picture I took. But we're not creating ads or canvassing campaigns, and we aren't in a war. We need to change how we talk. We need to think about how we talk in order to talk to each other in a more productive way. So I've been pulling, this is something I've done since I created the book. This is outside of the book. This is a process that I've adapted from, I said there was also some deep canvassing going on, which is a process that has been studied and been shown to convince people. And I believe Bonnie Tinker, who's a deceased Quaker, who had an organization called Love Makes a Family, and she trained people on how to do this sort of talking to people. And I've adapted her process. And she was also a major factor behind one of the major factors behind the gay rights campaign. So the model is to ask questions. Don't make assumptions. We all know what happens when you make assumptions, right? And the questions can vary. And there's a lot of different questions in the different situations. And then if we ask, we have to listen. But don't listen to find something to refute or to find something to disagree with. You need to find something to agree to. That was one of Bonnie's um, suggestions, and I think it's a great idea. But I think you also have to listen with new ears, because now that you've started to learn the moral foundations, you can see them. You need to listen for what moral foundations are being evoked. And then once you've done that, agree with something. And specifically, if you identified the moral foundation that's involved, agree that it's important, because they're all important and we all have them. We all need them. But where I part company with Bonnie is in the last step. She called it respond, and I changed that to reframe to reflect the moral foundations that I've been talking about in the process of how you do that, where you tie a different moral value than what the person was using to the issue. And maybe you can change people's minds when you do that. So I think I've probably achieved my second objective, which is to show you that there's a way to use this information. Let's go back to the story of my aunt to see how this could work. Here's what I wish I had said. Aunt Dot, you're talking about immigrants. Is that because you love this country so much? And then, if I did this right, I would shut up and listen. I could ask her questions about what she feels makes this country so great. But I would have named the invisible by recognizing the belonging the importance she placed on belonging in community, a key value. And then I could find something else to agree with her about. Affirm what she said. Yes, Aunt Dot, I agree, America is a great country. It's been very good to you and to me. We have freedom. We live much better lives than if we were born somewhere else. And then after I'd done that, I might have had an opening to make my point. I could have reframed it by using one of the other values that she finds important. Now, I happen to be a particular fan of the merit-based form of fairness, so I'm going to use that. I could have said, Jeannie works really hard to take care of you. You're well-fed, she keeps you clean, dresses you every day, she's always there. What do you think about immigrants like Jeannie who work hard? Should they be allowed to come to this country? I don't know what would have happened. I really don't. But because I had another way in, I don't think I would have stormed out. Maybe we could have had a conversation about those values that we ignore because they're invisible. And maybe we could have found a common ground. She might have changed her mind slightly, or she might not. But we would have been able to continue the conversation. And I would have had the last 18 months of her life to continue the relationship, a part of the fabric of my life that came unraveled in those tense-filled minutes. And I wouldn't have to feel quite so sad over the loss. That's what I mean when I say persuade, don't preach. If you want to learn more, I'll point you to my website, which is persuadedon'tpreach.com with no apostrophe in it. And there you're going to find links to a bunch of the resources that I've used, how to contact me for speaking events, the Willer video, and then also a link to my newsletter, Mending Fractured Relationships, where I take these concepts in new directions, applying what I've been learning from studying experts in various different fields like anthropology, peace building, historians, cult experts, all sorts of people, about how other ways to talk to people. And the link to that's on the resources page. And you and I and all of us can help this country come back together, one relationship at a time, if we learn how to persuade and not preach. So that's my canned talk. And I missed all these comments. Oh, thank you. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take us into an exercise from the book on the fairness. Moral foundation. And I want to, Kristen is going to put us into different groups. And I'm going to read some questions and I guess take 10 minutes to maybe 15 minutes to talk, for each take a turn to talk about your answers to these questions. And I'll put them in the chat. I'll read them aloud and then I'll put them in the chat as you're being put in the groups. Again, these are about the fairness. So which flavor of fairness do you prefer? Equality versus merit? Or there's a third one, which is favoring giving more to people who've been disadvantaged, which is equity. And do you ever use the other form? And I think we all use all three of them, but if we can start thinking about when we use different ones, that we actually can and should use all of them and think about them all and realize that we can prefer one or the other, but we also have to be fluent in the others. So with that, I will ask Kristen to put us into groups, and I will put the some of the questions in the chat, and people can and we'll come back and talk about them. Seems like we lost people.
Oh, the breakout rooms are still counting down, so they should all come back in the next
Okay.
30 seconds or so.
Okay, great. Good.
Everybody should be back now.
Okay. Reactions, questions? What you talk about in your group, and what do you think of what I've just presented?
I really enjoyed this presentation. I was excited to see it because I just finished this book and I had no idea it would come up. I thought, oh, look, I did the homework way ahead of time. And it's been the book I'm also a professor, and I'm constantly telling my students to read it. I'm telling all my friends and family members to read it. It is so profound. There's so many layers to it. So I think anyone who is at all intrigued by what you heard today, you really have to read the book and see the full framework and all of the different research and how it's kind of come together for the author to come to these conclusions. But it's so important. It's so important, especially in the global internet-based world we live in. We have to see how other people are viewing the world.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you. That's so great to hear that you liked it that much. I mean, you can tell it's in my voice. It's what I think. And so thank you again.
Well, I really like it too, and I'd like to get the book. And the best way to get it, or is it in any libraries or bookstores, or there's not any real bookstore at Richmond?
So it's available in a number of places. If you go to my website, there's links to a lot of places that stock it. So you can, but it's only available online. There are some libraries in my area that have it, but I haven't gotten it into many libraries. But it is available online for purchase. And if there's a bulk order, if you have a group that wants to read it, like do a book club kind of thing, I can send those directly, but I can't deal with individual orders.
We had a really rich discussion in our small group, and a few questions came out, but one of the ones that I'm curious about, how do you see this framework applying or working for advocacy, with congressional officials, for example, when it's not your peers, family members, neighbors, but elected officials with greater authority and potentially more ingrained ideologies and sort of scripted arguments and responses to any reframing that you might attempt with them. Do you have any thoughts or response to that?
So if you use reframing properly, you're going to short circuit their normal way of thinking. But you have to do it very carefully, and you gotta really rehearse this and practice it.
Mhm.
But there are, yes, they're on a track, they're so scripted, they know exactly what they think, but what this does is it disrupts that. So I think it can be really useful. Again, that's what Wilhelm Feinberg actually did specifically, is it disrupts it. And part of what's going on is the herd mentality, the group mentality. And by reframing it, you're saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe your group actually already believes this. And it kind of makes them, it just gets them out of that track.
I really love this presentation. And when you went through the slogans, I thought that was so powerful. And I'm going to think twice now whenever I see a slogan, like what's it, what is it trying to say? And the five different categories, what I liked about them was it gave me a framework that you're not painting people as bad, good or bad, or there's no judgment there really in any of those categories, and as a writer, it made me really aware of how can I use my words to persuade and not preach, and it was very, very powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I've done just a little bit of lobbying in healthcare reform, and I think what I've taken away is that the talking points that we prepared are more on the care side for universal health care or whatever. So reframing that and going to what the conservatives value, the loyalty and the that's the authority could be helpful to just, when you practice and kind of script what you want to say in a lobbying visit, kind of look at that and try to, try to state those in a conservative point of view would be good. I guess Bobby might agree with that as well.
Yeah, I really think that this is extremely potentially powerful lobbying tool because it just shakes everything up. It's like, wait a minute, I thought I believed this, but I also believe this other thing because, like I said, the 5 moral foundations conflict sometimes, and when they conflict, that's the opportunity you have to really use it. If they're all behind it, then there's no way you can disrupt it. Okay. Like, and as I talk about in the book, Laura, you may remember this, with abortion, I really don't see a way in because everything seems to be working so clearly in one direction. And I didn't put this in the book, but the only ways I see to disrupt that are ones that I would never, ever recommend because they're disrespectful to people. So I deliberately did not put them in the book because I do not want people thinking that way. But outside of abortion, I think almost every issue we have, and I talk about each of the major issues that we face in this country in the book, and how we can use it. And there's other ideas. I mean, those were just some ideas. There's really a lot of creativity that you can use. But you have to practice, as we talked about in the rooms. You can't do this on the fly unless you're one of the 10% of people. There are 10% of the population that does this instinctively. But if you're not one of those 10%, you have to practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I don't know if you can reframe the abortion, not that you're pro or against abortion, but you think that women should make their own choice. They tried to reframe that, but I don't know. I guess people don't think that women should make their own choice.
No, so that's a Care for Others moral foundation, and they're operating from a sanctity, purity moral foundation. And you're never going to win with a Care for Others for a conservative. You're just not. You're not going to win. You're not going to convince anybody. And as I said, I don't want to talk about the ways you could win because it's really demeaning. So I'm deliberately not saying that. I don't want this to be public. So I think we have to have our own limits. So I'm not going to talk about abortion. Donna.
Well, just a thought that in education, like, and I'm older now, so growing up, really the emphasis is on formulating your opinion and more becoming entrenched. The only opportunity I can remember for something different is if you did debating where they give you the exercise to take the opposite viewpoint to be able to argue your viewpoint. But it just, it's especially at the state of affairs that we're in, we need this early. We need that training, that education of this kind of thing early on in the schools and things like. I don't think I'll be the one to do it, but so, it's just because I think we go the other way. And that's all.
Yeah. I've just been working on one of my upcoming newsletters, and I talk in it about how the problems that we're facing are called wicked problems. So they aren't problems that you can solve easily, and there's a set of criteria for what makes them wicked problems. And that diverse groups that think in a diverse way are more easily able to solve wicked problems because they bring a bunch of different kinds of thinking. And right now we're just doing name calling. We're not listening to each other. And if we can start to listen to each other and talk to each other in a way that we can hear each other, which is what I'm trying to get people to do, then we're going to have more opportunity to solve the wicked problems. Bobby.
Does anyone else have a question? I don't want to take up too much space here.
Go ahead.
All right, I will. So what response might you have for people who might call this approach a negative kind of compromise and giving into a kind of conformity or assimilation and a respectability politics of sorts? I don't know. I feel like some of the young adults I work with, if I were to present this to them, they would push back very heavily and say, why would I talk in the words of my oppressor? Why, even if it's pragmatic, why would I compromise myself in this way to do this thing?
I haven't gotten this question before, so give me a minute. I have gotten the question of that it feels manipulative. And let me tell you my response to that, and that's in the book. So the response to the question of it being manipulative is that it isn't manipulative if you are willing to listen to the other person. It is manipulative if you're only using it to convince and you're not listening. I mean, in seminary, we talked about meeting people where they are, and this is really just another way of meeting people where they are. Okay. So my response is going to be very free form, and I hate that this is being recorded because I hate talking on the fly like this, but that's a very arrogant position. That you're talking to the, if you can't talk to the other person so they can hear you, then you want to go off and live by yourself somewhere? I mean, or do you want to contribute to society? I mean, are you trying to make this world a better place? Or are you just trying to make this world more at war? I mean, that's just the begin. I would, I'm sure I would like to come back to you with another response after I've given it some more thought, because I'm an introvert, okay? So I don't do well on the spot.
Bobby, if I may speak for him a minute, he works for Friends Committee on National Legislation. You may know that, so he does that. But it relates to what if they don't listen? So we have a very entrenched Republican, and this whole Republican thing of voting with the party, even though you know a person. Like we have one legislator who has some conscience in these things and works towards bipartisan, and yet he has ambition too. So he voted on the Republican side as far as the impeachment or finding guilty or whatever. So sometimes you feel like they're not going to listen to you. But I had another seminar here where there was a suggestion to do it anyway, kind of do things like that anyway, but you have to detach from outcome. And, so you question, with your energy level limited, do you do it anyway? Even though unlikely to have a positive outcome. But so I'm not being very articulate, but it kind of related to feeling a little, I think a lot of us feel a little hopeless because I guess we're hanging on to wanting it to come out our way. We'd have to let go of that a little bit.
Yeah, although this works, it doesn't work every time, and it doesn't work with all people. It just works better than the alternative.
Okay.
I think it's really good if you can keep the focus on the other person, because it starts to, I actually really believe in speaking to people in language they can relate to. I don't mind changing my my way of speaking to adjust to something that somebody else can grasp. And I don't even mind, for example, I have said to sort of fundamentalist or very literalist types of Christian, isn't it amazing how these same stories have an allegorical meaning as well as a literal meaning, referring to the Bible. yeah, or isn't God great that he was able to arrange this so that these stories have both an allegorical and a literal interpretation? But you know, I've been involved with Friends General Conference, and I talked to someone who's been very involved, and he said whenever anybody asked him if he's saved, he says yes. And I feel like that he says, do you consider yourself to be saved? I said, well, yes, but I don't think that's what they're asking, you know, and that's where it starts to get into an integrity question. If you know that somebody means something different from what you actually mean, then, you know, but is failure to disclose that a lack of integrity?
Tough questions.
Mm.
You guys are tough. This is the toughest group I've had. The issue of integrity is an important one, and as Quakers, you know, we need to be true to ourselves. And early Quakers would have said, absolutely not. Do not change what you're saying for the other person. But I'm more in the camp of the priority is peace on earth for me. And we aren't going to have peace if we're shouting what we believe and not listening.
There's a quote from Martin Luther King that I like, and it's people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. And I think that to find some common ground in our language helps us to communicate, you know, when we're not. But I've come across this in the interfaith world, you know, like folks in the interfaith seminary that I went to that would be so up in arms about the word Lord, for instance, you know, and I think for me, like, that's not necessarily a word I might use. I might not, I might or might not, but it's okay if somebody else does, you know, and then I use my word, you know, if we can get to that place where we're okay with each other's words, but right now we don't seem to be there, you know, so if we can find those common words, we can communicate.
Yeah, something a wise person said to me once, or I heard them say in a retreat setting, that we need to translate for each other. And, you know, and we're the only people we can change ourselves. The only people we can change ourselves. Yes, yes, Bobby, listening in tongues. Absolutely. I've heard somebody explain what I'm doing as listening in tongues.
Oh.
Yeah, I was so pleased when I found your work because, you know, about 2 years ago when I first started working on staff with the Friends Committee, I came across the concept of listening in tongues, and I'm a social science student by training. So I had read some of the moral psychology, moral foundations theory stuff and found Feinberg and Willie's experiments. It was like, there's some connection here, but I can't quite articulate it. And then I found your work and I was like, someone else saw it. I'm so happy.
Yeah, it's been so frustrating to me because I hear people who love Haidt's book, but then they don't know what to do with it. And Willer and Feinberg have the answer, but they aren't as well known as Haidt. And, you know, I asked Rob Willer if he would work on a book with me, and he said no, he was too busy. So, I mean, he's got a social science lab out in Stanford and he's busy, you know, but he was fine with me doing it. So.
Can you say more about that? Because I don't know if I completely understand the speaking in tongues.
You can speak, if you can speak in such a way that somebody can understand you when it's not your normal way. It's the same thing as if you were in Pentecost and speaking in tongues.
Okay. Yeah.
What's the name of this scientist? And also, what's your website?
My website is persuadedon'tpreach.com with no apostrophe in the don't.
Okay.
And there's a way to order my book. There's a link to my newsletter. And and other resources, link to Willer's talk, link to some other books that are important, some other organizations that are doing things, deep canvassing, all sorts of things that I think are going to be useful for people doing this work. Because this work is not easy. I mean, if it was easy, you would have done it already.
Right. Well, the other thing you say that it seems easy, but it's not, and it's kind of one of these things occurring because I make a lot of assumptions, and it's kind of a part of implicit bias. But to learn to ask questions and not make assumptions. And I used to think, oh, my intuition's so good, I really know, but I don't. I'm often wrong, and it limits my world. So it was good advice not to ask, not make assumptions.
Yeah, and what I'm doing in the newsletter is I'm reading and summarizing what a lot of different experts from different fields are saying about what kind of questions are useful. I mean, there's a standard question of saying something like, I really want to understand what you're thinking. Can you explain your ideas to me? That's like a standard question that works with anybody. But if you're dealing with a cult member, there may be some specific questions you want to ask. If you're dealing with a conspiracy theory person, you might want to ask other questions. If you're dealing with various different situations require, or rather can be helped by different kinds of questions. Yes, Jan.
Can you give some examples of good questions for conspiracy theory people?
Yeah, how long have you believed this? Where did you hear about it? How did you come to trust that this person was telling you the truth? Have you checked it out with other people? How does it compare to what you thought beforehand? If you can get them to start thinking. So one of the problems that's happening in our society is that people are choosing somebody to believe and not thinking about what the person's saying and just accepting what the other person is saying. So if you can get people to start thinking for themselves, and they can deprogram themselves.
You know, this person that I'm thinking of thinks it is the height of independent thinking to believe what she believes. And she believes she has found all this truth by her independent research on the internet. And so she sees herself as a deep researcher in search of truth and has found the truth.
So there's a difference between critical thinking and so I talk about. I'm going to refer you to my newsletter because I haven't talked to them. I have summarized what a number of experts in conspiracy thinking have learned and what they suggest. And it's not mine. This is what they say. But there's definitely a newsletter about that, and she's exactly on. It's exactly what everybody thinks. What she's saying is exactly what everybody who believes this a conspiracy thing does. Actually, I just read an advanced copy of a book on cults, which isn't exactly a conspiracy theory, but there was this new book that's going to be out in March on the Sherry Shiner cult, which was just out. It was very, very good. It's going to be a show on Vice Media in March. And it was talking about how people, the way it feeds into what people need and how, and they don't really talk about how to get people out. The cult experts that I'm discussing in the newsletter talk about how to get people out of it. And again, you're not getting them to believe you instead of the sources. You're getting them to start thinking.
Well, that would be nice. But are your newsletters available on your website?
There's a link to them on my website. They're free. So, and just go back it'll give you the link to the overall website, and then just pick the ones that apply to you.
Okay. So I'm looking at it right now. And I'm not seeing the newsletters.
The newsletters are not on the website. The newsletters are somewhere else. You have to link to them to find them. So go to on the home page. Let me go to my website.
Just put it in the chat, friends.
Yeah. Oh, Bobby just put it in the chat. There's the direct link.
Yeah, I saw that, but it looked like it's just one newsletter.
If you go to that site, there's a whole bunch of newsletters.
I have another question for you. Feel free to not answer it if you
Okay.
don't want to. But I'm curious if you have found any critiques or gaps in this theory as you've been doing some deeper research on it. Is it missing something? Has it gone wrong in its use? Any pitfalls that you found?
Moral foundations? Yeah, and I talk about that in the book. There's two other ones that I've added in the book. I've added the rationality one, which gets at the idea that we think we can argue on facts, but facts don't work.
Yeah.
Except sometimes they do. And knowing when they do is, and because there's certain people, coming from a business background, there's certain times you have to make the best decision, the most rational decision. And when is that? And thinking that through. And that moral foundation theory doesn't address that at all. Although his mentor that he borrows the theory from, that he expands on it, does talk about it. So it's not like I made this up. Okay, I didn't make it up. I'm taking it from Richard Fisk and from another theorist whose name I'm blanking on right now. So rationality is another one. And then finally, what I think we need to work towards is an understanding moral foundation, that what will be moral is when we fully understand each other. And that comes from spiral dynamics. Again, I didn't make it up. I'm pulling together a bunch of threads from a bunch of places.
I love spiral dynamics.
Yeah? So then it's going towards our orange. I think it's not orange. It's purple. I'm not sure. I always get confused with the colors, which is why I named it. I didn't use colors. But I think that's where and that's what I view what I'm doing as, is helping people reach that level of understanding about the other. If we can learn to talk to each other, then we can learn to come together. And again, I see this as part of the peace testimony of Quakers. Maria, do you have anything that you want to chime in on? Questions?
Yes, it might be a harsh question, which is why I didn't necessarily ask it, but it's related to the question that Bobby asked about where you might be going wrong. Because I was thinking about, well, first of all, I really enjoyed this presentation, so don't take it as a criticism, because it really helped me reframe how I think about things. But I was also thinking how values like purity
I think we lost you, Maria.
Yeah, she froze.
Yeah,
You froze.
You froze.
This was happening earlier in our breakout group.
She can use the chat. Oh, there you are.
Okay, sorry about that. This keeps happening to me. I was thinking about the concept of purity and how it's used by white supremacists, and whether are we, by compromising in our language, are we supporting this type of values like purity as like we are better than other people? Does that make sense?
You're refocusing them, so they focus on another part of it. Because what you'll hear from people who are in that is that they create exceptions, and the more exceptions they create, the more it tears down that belief, and then they get to know people, and the hopefully what will happen is that they'll begin to move on because they'll start to feel less threatened. But right now they're feeling very threatened, so they rely on that as their source of comfort when it's actually a misapplied source of comfort. So you're helping them in the long term.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts on, I know you're probably out of time now, but thinking of the people at the Capitol, and suddenly I'm blocking all terms that have been used to call them. They were so violent. And if you heard the trial part, you heard some of the language they were saying to each other. It was really violent and very graphic. I don't know how you talk to them. I think that I actually have a little fear of my life, for my life. You're probably obviously not at the Capitol, not during that, but so I don't know what I'm saying. I'd like to do work, even with the hardcore polarizing group, but they're so violent. I don't know even how to approach it. I don't want to die necessarily while talking.
No, I mean, we have to put our own safety first, okay, and our own mental health first. And you need to be well supported in doing this work. You can't just go off by yourself and do it. You need to have support. And, so I advocate creating a support group, people who've read the same things, working together on it, practice what you're saying, try it out. Think things through, and a lot of these people had problems, right? They need help, but the problem is often when we approach people like that, we appear condescending. And my hope is that if we can use their language, we will stop appearing so condescending. Because right now we are people who disagree with them are triggering to them. We're triggering to each other. How can we stop this triggering of each other? Maria, yes?
Do you have any advice on what type of relationships might be easier to start with, to start practicing?
You have to have, the relationships easier to start with is ones that have a history, where you can see the other parts of the person. The more superficial relationships are harder because you don't hear the other part. So I just got an email about an hour before this that has kind of rocked my world, because this is a woman who's been a friend of mine for a long time, and she's very conservative. She's been a major supporter of my work. And she just read my post on talking to cult members, and it triggered her. And she's been trying to figure out what to say to me afterwards since then. And, I'm going to engage. I sent her an email right before we got online. And I said, I really want to talk to you more about this. I said, I'm trying to figure out how what I said, she misstated what I had said in the post. So she was somehow not really reading. Now she has a graduate degree, so like it's not like she doesn't read English, okay? I'm trying to figure out how I can connect with her, but I have a long-standing relationship with her, and she's a woman I want to do this with, and that's where you need to start.
Part of the problem to me is that people are coming from a different set of facts. I mean, this is a huge problem because there's no joint set of information. So one of the things about my friend is she is really outraged and upset because she feels that the left justifies the violence of the Black Lives Matter protests, claiming that the Black Lives Matter protesters were extremely violent. And she also puts into the category of violence property damage. So she's really, and she claims she's not a Republican, but whatever. Her friends all say that, they're in fear for their lives because of these Black Lives Matter protesters that are threatening their existence and their business and their cities, etc. And so then it's so unfair that people are criticizing the Trump protesters. And this is just a bunch of nonsense. So I think where I'm going is, this may be not a very good example, but there's no common set of facts. If you send her a fact check on anything, she says the fact checkers are not reliable and they're biased. And if you send her news articles, she says the mainstream media can't be trusted. So I don't know where you go when there's no common reality to discuss, regardless of the values.
You ask them questions and ask them to tell you the facts.
Okay, the facts are the Black Lives Matter were so much more violent than any.
Okay, so tell me how many, what's the damage? What's the value of the damage? How many deaths? Who had guns? Specific questions. So there's a psychology theory called the illusion of explanatory depth. Okay, I'm going to get very psychology on you. Okay. And what illusion of explanatory depth says is that we think we know how things work, and we really don't. Okay? We think we know how a car works. We think we know how a toilet works. We think we know how a zipper works. We think we know how financial services work. We don't. We know how to use them. We don't know how they work. We don't know what happens exactly. And what happens is when you ask the questions, where you ask people to explain to you in detail, specifically, how these things work, or how financial services work, or how the Black Lives Matter protesters, how many, when you ask specific questions and you don't just allow them to make these grand statements that they don't really have facts to back them up. Now, to do this and not do it in a way that's condescending and not do it in a way that's accusatory is hard, okay? But, I really want to understand what you're thinking, but I haven't found any facts to back this up, so I'm really hoping you can help me find the facts. Can you show me where the counts are, the number of people who died and the number of people who are injured, and can you show me where the news stories are? Oh, you don't have any. Well, maybe they're somewhere else. Can you, let's see if we can find them together.
Well, if you look at Fox News, actually Fox News reported that 2,000 police officers were injured during the Black Lives Matter protests. And then there's some fact checks that say that isn't true. So we get into the fact that there's something out there to support what she's saying, but it, in fact, may not be accurate.
There's a lot of media literacy questions. I'm working on a post about that, and it's not perfect, but there's a lot of, yeah. I don't have all the answers, sorry. But getting people to really start questioning what they think and where the facts come from, and that's got to be the key. That's all we can do, is just keep asking questions. We haven't heard from Yvonne. I'm sorry. I feel like I've been ignoring you. Is there anything you'd like to ask?
I'm sorry I joined the call late, having problems with time difference, but I find your work and thoughts very interesting. I will admit that I am probably from the opposite viewpoint of most of those on the phone, but I have a desire to be able to communicate with people who don't necessarily share the same views, and I want to communicate in a manner that is reasonable and respectful, and I have a hard time understanding you, as you probably have a hard time understanding me. So I find your thoughts interesting, even if we don't come from the same perspective.
Well, thank you for being welcoming and open to thinking about other points of view. Um, you know, I've run into this with my friend right now who is conservative, and I just gave a talk at a conservative Christian university in Southern Indiana in November. So I'm trying to bridge the two, but I find myself more in liberal circles. So it appears like I'm liberal, and I'm sort of in the middle.
Now I understand. You know, I kind of probably would just say I find myself in liberal circles. I don't know. I find myself in both circles, and I'm just trying to bridge the gap because I do agree that the shouting and the name calling definitely doesn't get us anywhere. And I think most people have a common ground. It's just hard for people to actually engage with each other in a respectful manner to try to find that common ground. And there does seem to be a lot of not thinking for oneself or not being able to go back and do that self work to try to understand why you think this way and why you don't. So I appreciate the work that you're trying to do. And I think it's important for, regardless of which side of the spectrum we may fall on, to remember that we all are, God's creatures. And ultimately that should be something that hopefully puts us a pause in anything that might become more negative. So.
And that part of being God's creatures is we all have the same values. You probably missed this because you turned in late, but we all have the same 5 moral foundations. They are all the same. We just have differences because of the difference in importance and the difference in interpretation. And if we can understand that and honor that within one another, those differences, and see them as productive ways to help us find other ways to solve the wicked problems in the world, because we're here to make the world a better place. And unless we can respect each other and talk to each other, we're never going to solve the problems, because we're just creating more problems between each other instead of working towards the problems that we need to solve, of poverty and environmental issues. And what's the real problems, not just the fights that we're having with each other.
Right. I do agree with you on that. So thank you. And I do appreciate your work and look forward to looking up your stuff and reading a little bit more on it.
Great. Well, if I can be of service to anybody who has a group they wanted me to talk to, I would love to do that. I want to get the word out about this work, and I'm going to be giving talks to various different Quaker organizations and meetings. I've given talks to libraries. I've given talks to civic groups like Rotary clubs, and I'm going to be on Saturday. I'm talking to the board. I guess tomorrow I'm talking to the board of a group called Civility First out in the state of Washington, which seems to be doing great work. And I really would love to just help provide this information in any way I can. No, my rates are not on there. I will work within whatever your budget.
So can I say a couple of experiences? Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a very good friend from the community from Olney Friends School, and I got into a talk with her about gay issues, LGBT, whatever. But it was several years ago, so it didn't have all those letters at the end. But it was a very easygoing conversation. But I mean, she had the gay people or one night stand type, and she just listened to me, and I kind of won her over. It was really not hard, but I didn't go too far. I didn't tell her like that I'm bisexual. I didn't tell her that, I just but it was really nice. It was, she said, well, I never thought of that. Well, that's, that was a real success, I guess. You're following your principles. And then I have another friend right now from college. I found out, a Trump supporter and a Fox News watcher, and she says Fox is the only news that has the truth and things like that. But she told me that, and she even accused me of not being a Quaker from something I said anymore, and being a Democrat. So she's pretty far out there, but I think I can make some headway, because she keeps writing back and calling me a friend, and told me that she gives money to Native Americans. Well, I've given money to Native American organizations too, so there's a common ground, that we can talk about. And you're having trouble hearing me now, huh?
Yeah.
So, and then the bad experience, the hopeless experience I had was talking to people years ago when I got separated from my liberal group, and I got into conversation, and I said, well, we had the scientist at Earlham. It was about, I was talking about, oh, Earlham, it was just like so disrespectful. It was. So it just seemed hopeless to talk to them, Did you hear?
Yeah, that's great that you had some successes. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I'm feeling like this is kind of complete. We're almost at the end of the time. And I want to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And I hope to run into you in some other forum. Please, again, feel free to contact me through my website or through ESR. I really appreciate the time and the energy that it took to spend time here, and hope I can be helpful.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you for the work you're holding.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah,